School District regular meeting of the Board of Education. Today is December 14th, 2021. Let's call the meeting to order and begin with roll call, please.
Member Wood?
Here.
Member Jarrell?
Here.
Member Girardi?
Here.
Member Cornett?
Here.
And Member Espericueta?
Here.
Item 2 is a study session this evening, and Dr. Susie.
Yes. Thank you, President Wood. Just a reminder for everybody, we are on YouTube right now, and we are providing Spanish translation, so encourage you to use the microphone even though there's nobody here in the audience with us.
Sorry.
You're okay. Just by way of a very brief introduction to today's study session on trustee areas, I wanted to just set the stage before we have our speaker, our consultant who's helping us with the scenarios, give the bulk of the presentation. So today we will discuss the legal requirements and factors to be considered in redistricting. We'll look at the 2020 census data for the district and how the population changed between 2010 and 2020, and why that then requires us to create some new trustee area balance. We will look at the current trustee areas and then the 4 new trustee area scenarios, and then have time for questions and also discuss next steps, what the district is going to do and then what the board will be doing. So just as a reminder, this started in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, saying that all districts within a political jurisdiction have to have a substantial equality of population. And that's calculated just as the total population. And over time, the Supreme Court determined that they could be up to 10% different, that would still make them be considered a minor deviation in size. And so you'll see today, again, the proposed scenarios are much lower than that 10% variance. California Ed Code asks that after every 10-year census, school districts adjust their trustee area boundaries so that they're near equal in their population. And this has to be completed prior to March 1st. And so for us, that's by the end of February 28th, 2022. And this year, the entire timeline has been compressed because the census data was released so late. So that's caused districts across the state to be in a little bit of a scramble. The Federal Voting Rights Act in 1965, that's where the guidance comes in, making sure that we're not diluting the voting power of racial, ethnic, and language minorities. I found it very interesting that some of the previously used techniques that violated the Voting Rights Act were concentrating minority group voters into as few districts as possible to dilute their voting effectiveness across the region, or dividing up that population among multiple districts to dilute their voting effectiveness. So today you'll see that the proposed scenarios do not do any of that and still are well within the legal requirements and would be a positive for our community. It also requires that when there are cohesive minority groups that have had a difficulty electing a candidate of choice, that they be provided with the opportunity for effective representation. And again, you can even see in our own Palm Springs, trustee voting. Again, I know we all were celebrating with Mr. Espericueta when he was first elected to the board, and we made note of that, he being the first Latino or Latinx board member in the district, which was very positive. Some of the redistricting criteria that are looked at is to make sure that the trustee areas are compact and contiguous, they have easily identifiable boundaries, and they maintain and respect communities of interest as much as possible. And then again, we'll have some more criteria discussed here in just a moment. Community of interests are areas where people share that same social or economic interest, such as neighborhoods, communities, areas with similar racial and ethnic composition or cultural identities. It also includes those social and civic networks like schools, churches, homeowners associations, retirement communities, etc. So with that introduction, I am going to turn it over to Mr. Clark from Cooperative Strategies, who will give the presentation and then answer any questions that the board might have.
Hello and good evening. Good to see you all, hopefully this time, compared to last time being virtual. But good evening. Again, thank you very much for having us. I greatly appreciate your time. I greatly appreciate your effort in order to build this as a work session or to go through this and help provide some clarity and transparency throughout this process. And so thank you again to the board, superintendent, and cabinet for this. And so as superintendent mentioned, every 10 years, we have to go through this process in the state of California. And so this is a renewal process to see if we are in or without compliance. I'm going to kind of brush over some of this information as some of it is a repetitive information that was already previously spoken. And so basically what we have to do when the new census is released, we have to review the new census and determine if the school district is actually within that total population variance. So just keep in mind throughout this process when we're looking at scenarios, when we're looking at data, the primary mover of this process is the total population variance. And so with that, we see a maximum population variance of 10%. And so that's basically taking the difference between the largest trustee area and the smallest trustee area. And so some background knowledge, as the superintendent mentioned, the census data wasn't actually finalized and released until September 27th. And so obviously that is much later time frame than how it usually is. And so it has compacted all municipalities throughout the state of California to go through this process and get everything finalized before that February 28th, 2022 deadline. And so as we look at that deadline, we look at our proposed calendar and our timeline for what Palm Springs Unified is going to move forward with. Obviously, we are meeting today, December 14th, to look at some revised or possible additional scenarios as we move from the November board meeting. Unfortunately, we didn't have anything that was revised or additional scenarios, so we are here to offer any additional help and see if we can solicit any information from cabinet, board, and then obviously community members in the forums moving forward to see if we could even build any additional scenarios moving forward. And that would be the process moving from December through January. And then we'll actually meet again January 11th, and the board will actually adopt the final trustee area map process moving forward. And then we'll be able to finalize this through the county registers of voters. And then one thing I believe we are going to do throughout this process is actually hold a community dialogue or input meeting. And so that's going to allow the community to come in, actually do physical drawings if they want, give additional input, talk about the scenarios, meet about communities of interest, and see maybe where our shortfalls are within the current 4 scenarios.
So I'll just jump in here just really quickly to talk about those community forums. So 2 additional things that the district is going to be doing. After today's presentation, we're going to be posting on the website the 4 current scenarios along with a link for community members to comment on each of those scenarios, and then another link where they can make suggestions for any other alternative scenarios. We will then be scheduling 2 community input sessions, one in Palm Springs and one in Desert Hot Springs, and we're looking to do that in those first 2 weeks of January, which would then require us to move back the board's final approval of the maps to the second board meeting in January. Instead, on our original timeline, we had January 11th, but because of our winter break goes through all the way to January 10th, we would move back the board's decision to the last board meeting in January. Thank you.
Absolutely, and we can make those changes moving forward. And then so, as Superintendent Wise mentioned, the considerations for building these trustee areas and building these conceptual maps has to do with each area shall contain equal number of inhabitants throughout. We want to make sure that we draw to comply with Federal Voting Rights Act as well as the California Voting Rights Act, which is also known as CVRA. We want to make sure that they're compact and contiguous as much as possible, make sure that we're not looking like the state of Hawaii with different islands throughout our maps. And then we want to make sure that we respect communities of interest as much as possible. That is a lot of the feedback that we are trying to get, because obviously everybody here and throughout the community knows the community the best. We are obviously coming in as a third party trying to build and support throughout this process. We want to follow man-made and natural geographic features as much as possible. We want to respect incumbency if that is possible. And then some other local considerations such as school boundaries, locations of schools, how many schools are in each trustee area. Is that something that we might want to consider? Any other kind of considerations? Do we want to follow, airport district boundaries or something like that? Take those into consideration as we're moving forward. And so we can start by kind of jumping into the 2020 census data and seeing kind of what is going on throughout the district, where our total population is, and then where our age 18 plus population is from that most recent 2020 census data. And so as you can see, we have a total population of over 175,000 constituents. The primary driver of that is the Hispanic Latino demographics of almost 81,000 total population. And then from there, we have our white demographic group coming in at 74,000. And then we have Black African Americans are at 6,500. We have an Asian population of just over 7,000. Two or more races almost at 5,000. And then the American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and other reaching about 1,500 total population. And then so if we start to shift into our voting age of looking at 18 and plus, you could start to see a shift from that Hispanic Latino population being the driver now to the white Caucasian demographics being the driver of that 18 plus of 69,000 compared to the Hispanic Latino population of 56,000. And then from there, again, we still have a very large Asian group, demographic population of 6,200, Black African Americans, just over 5,000 total constituents, and the remainder making up about 4,000 total population. So if we dive a little bit deeper into our a primary driver of that Hispanic Latino demographic in that protected class, we want to look at the CVAP data. And so CVAP data is the citizen voting age population estimates. And these are coming directly from the 2015 to 2019 projections. Unfortunately, this data is not available moving forward after the 2020 census data because it doesn't actually get finalized until after the 2020 and the most recent census data is finalized. And so as the census data was delayed, this data is also delayed. But it gives us a better representation of where this protected class really resides and where it sits. And so obviously this is kind of a heat map for what we're looking at. The darker red portions represent a deeper amount of Hispanic Latino population that resides within that particular area. However, I will say and note that this map sometimes could be a little misleading because you look at areas and you say, well, this is a very deep red area that could constitute to a very large Hispanic Latino population. That may not be the case. It could be somewhere out in a rural area where there's maybe one family, something like that. So this just gives us a better representation of where that population resides throughout the district. And so if we look at our current trustee areas, I do apologize as trustee area number 5 is cut off from this picture, but when we look at our current trustee areas, we want to make sure that we keep this in mind as we start to look at this adjustments for the proposed 4 scenarios. And again, this process is to try and just simply make small adjustments based upon the total population data from the most recent census data that was released. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel and build some type of new scenarios from what we already currently have. And so with that, we could go back and look at the 2010 CVAP data, which is the citizen voting age population, which is the 18 plus, which is your physical voting population. And we can actually see the breakdown of where that population resides within each trustee area. So this kind of gives us a good representation of where those majority, minority, and those majority districts and populations reside in what individual trustee area. And so obviously, if we look at the CVAP data for the Hispanic Latino community, we have a good majority in trustee area number 2 for that CVAP data. We have a good representation throughout trustee area number 5 for the Black African American community. And then within the Asian community, which is another very large demographic, is actually going to be, again, within trustee area number 2. So kind of keep that in mind as we look at these because they might shift and move up and down a little bit based upon our new census data. And so from there, we'll kind of jump into the proposed scenarios and see kind of what we did, how we came up with, kind of the total population variance and see, see if it's a small change visually to a map consensus compared to what the actual demographics and what the numbers actually say. And so our scenario 1, we had slight changes throughout 4 of the 5 trustee areas. Slight movements throughout each one. Obviously, as we go in and we try to make adjustments, we try to see what are the minimal amount of adjustments we can make in order to meet that 10% total population variance. Obviously, if you see from the 2010 census data to now the 2020 census data, we are way out of compliance at well over 20%. So we might have to make adjustments in all 4, if not all 5 trustee areas throughout this process. And so in scenario 1, we actually took that total population variance from 21.8% all the way down to 4.8%. And that's based upon trying to have total equal number of inhabitants for each trustee area. So if you look at that total, the breakdown, very equal throughout. We don't have anything that's super high or super low. Trustee area 5 is probably the lowest throughout all of them. And again, that 4.8% comes from trustee area 5 as the lowest. And then you can flip a coin between trustee area 1 and trustee area number 2. Obviously, trustee area number 1 has 2 more total constituents in that particular area, but looking at the variance, you can flip a coin. And so what does that look like when we physically look at the visual representation in a map? And so with these slight adjustments, again, we build our maps, we build it upon the census blocks, which again is almost like looking at it in the sense of acreage, right? If you have one particular area that might be closely condensed in multifamily units, that's gonna skew if you move boundaries based upon that multifamily home, or if you have lots of families living within a closely density populated area. And so here, you can see those physical changes from trustee area number 5, the purple. Now you have trustee area 1 kind of moving up into trustee area 5. You have trustee area number 4, the blue, kind of moving into trustee area number 5 and a little bit into number 1. And then you have trustee area number 2, which is the green space, moving northward up into trustee area number 1, as well as trustee area number 3, actually moving a little bit north into trustee area 1 and east into trustee area number 1. And so these are kind of the small little shifts that we're looking at. Sometimes when we're looking at the census blocks themselves, sometimes they can be very large in size. And so you might say, I want to make a little movement and change here. Visually, that's going to be a big change compared to making maybe a different change somewhere else. And so some of this obviously is a good representation of a small change throughout 4 of the trustee areas. And what we had previously, obviously the previous trustee area boundaries, you can actually see within that blue boundary lines within this map. And so that's could give you a better representation of what we had previously to now what we're looking at moving forward. So if we dive a little bit deeper into the actual demographics, we can look at that Hispanic Latino population highlighted in blue, but then we also want to look at that gray column, which is the CVAP data, which is what I mentioned previously. Again, we still have a good majority in that trustee area number 2, looking at 52.9%. Again, and then again, if we look at that Black African American community, we actually increase the numbers from our current trustee area boundaries to now our scenario 1 to 11.3% in trustee area number 5. And then matching what we currently have to what we propose with scenario 1 with the Asian community as well, having a good majority in trustee area number 2 at over 9%. And so this kind of shows the up and down scale of what happens when we start to build scenarios and we start to move around those census blocks.
So just one other comment for the board. I just want to point out that currently trustee area number 2 is our trustee area where there is a majority of Hispanic or Latino voters, and that maintains in this proposed scenario. And trustee area 5 and then area 4 also then have the higher percentage of African American voters, which is also the way that it was in the 2010 census as well. So it doesn't cause those 3 trustee areas to shift in terms of the demographics that they're serving. There is a shift in the number and percentage, and that's required so that we meet that 10% or less variance.
Correct. And you're going to get that with a growing district such as Palm Springs. And so as the community and as the demographics and your total population grows, those demographics might shift a little bit throughout your 5 trustee areas. And so again, just kind of refresh us of where our current boundaries are. This is the current trustee area boundaries. And then we can look at what we kind of did for scenario 2. And so scenario 2, if you look at that bottom right-hand corner of the screen, that's a 6.5% variance. And so we moved up a little bit within our total population variance, but we're still within that total 10%. But we actually had some different shifts in multiple areas across multiple trustee areas, as you can see in our bottom 2 bullet points on the very top of the screen. You have trustee area 3 moving slightly into areas number 2 and 5. And then you have trustee areas 4 also moving into areas 5 and 2, not just minor adjustments. They're moving now. All 5 trustee areas are kind of getting some shifts as we look at the demographics. And so what does that look like visually? You can see here trustee area number 1, that yellow on the top of the screen, moves really far westward into trustee area number 5. And so that's a big area that kind of moves west. And then you have trustee area number 4 that actually moves really far north now throughout trustee area number 5. Compared to what it currently is. And then we had some shifts in trustee area number 3 moving north into trustee area number 4 and also trustee area number 2, so moving north into the blue and green portions of the map that you can see. And then again, just like in scenario 1, scenario 2, we had trustee area number 2 moving northward into trustee area number 1, the yellow. So green to yellow in that transfer. So again, still small changes. However, those census blocks sometimes, like I mentioned before, can be very large in size. There might not be a lot of population within those. There might be rural areas where we move these blocks and we start to shift things around, which is really not going to change the overall demographic scheme of things. Just visually, you can see a big difference compared to from scenario 1 to scenario 2. And again, if we look at the actual demographics, again, we still hold a majority demographic group with that Hispanic Latino community in trustee area number 2. We have a good representation in our Black African American community in trustee area 5 at almost 11%, so we decreased that one a little bit. And then we also decreased the Asian population to 8.2% in trustee area number 2 compared to almost 9% there. And so you did have some shifts. However, we had some pluralities and we shifted the demographics across multiple trustee areas in our scenario 2 compared to scenario 1. So again, just to refresh us for what we currently have, our current trustee area boundaries, what those look like, where those boundaries are, where they're marked, and what our scenario 3 looks at. Obviously, we continue to increase that variance. We're still below that 10%. However, now we're at 8.3%, so we're getting closer to that 10% variance. One of the things I often say is, again, remember, you have to go through this process every 10 years when the new census data comes out. So as population shifts, are we still going to be within that 10% allowance if we creep forward with that 8.3% variance? Just a side note. And so obviously as we look at this, we have multiple areas transitioning and moving into multiple trustee areas. So this is not something where looking at the data, we actually shifted a lot throughout the 5 trustee areas compared to maybe scenarios 1 and scenarios 2. However, if we actually look at the shifts, they don't seem as large as what they will within the data itself. And so you still have trustee area 1 moving into trustee area 5, very similar to scenario 1 with trustee area number 4 moving into the blue moving into the yellow as well as moving into the purple, which is areas 1 and 5. But then we also had some changes down south where we had trustee area number 3 moving north into trustee area number 4, so the red moving into the blue. And then we had trustee area 4 actually moving east into trustee area number 2, which is a little bit different compared to our first 2 scenarios. And then trustee area 2 moves a little bit north, just like the previous 2 scenarios. And so just a little bit of a different variation of trustee area 1. However, that variance again is much higher from 4.9% to 8.3%. So if we look at the demographics, again, they replicate and we try to stay as close as we can to what we currently have. And so we have a good majority of that Hispanic Latino community in trustee area number 2. We still have a good representation of Black African American community in trustee area number 5, so we increased that back over 11%. And then our Asian population, we still have a good representation in trustee area number 2 of 8%. So that's decreased slightly throughout our previous 2 scenarios. And so again, we're just shifting things around a little bit, seeing what we can do with the demographics and seeing what we can do with the census blocks for what we have available. Again, just kind of going back and refreshing the memory of where our current boundaries are. And then if we look at scenario 4, we actually have the lowest total variance on scenario 4 at 4.7%, but if you look at our scenario 4 adjustments, we actually have multiple adjustments in multiple areas that kind of shift and move rather than making some minor adjustments throughout this scenario. And so again, we still decreased it from 21.8% to 4.7%. Again, this is the lowest variance, but visually, when you look at this one, you can see how large some of those census blocks are, especially in that kind of northwest corner of the district. You can see how large those census blocks are. When we start to make small little changes, we have to go a little bit further. We have to go a little bit further in order to get within a good variance of our total map. And so you can see trustee area number 1 really moves west into trustee area number 4 and 5. So the yellow really moves west into the blue and the purple. We have trustee area number 5 really moves north as well trustee area number 4 really moves north into trustee area number 5. And then we also have trustee area 3 really moves north into trustee area number 4, trustee area number 2, and trustee area number 1. So visually, you can see those multiple changes throughout each trustee area. But again, if we look at the demographics and the data, they have a good representation, such as our previous 3 scenarios. And so our Hispanic Latino community, we still hold a majority in trustee area number 2. In our Black African American community, we actually increase our representation to 12.4% in trustee area number 5. And then our Asian community, we still hold steady at about 8.2% within trustee area number 2. But then we increase trustee area 1 of our Asian community to 5.8%. So again, those are just some iterations and some adjustments that what we have for our 4 proposed scenarios. Again, we're here to get information from you, solicit information from the community as far as what are some other possible boundaries and some things that we should possibly look at of our communities of interest to add additional scenarios or make iterations to the ones we currently have. So at this time, I'll be more than happy to take questions, comments from board and cabinet moving forward throughout this process.
Questions or comments?
Chris comments. When I see the existing map, the previous board members, they make good job to have the trusted areas compact. And I see your example or your proposed scenarios starting with the first ones, it's very similar to the original map, and then going to make the bigger changes. And I don't have a lot of comments because all maps look the all 4 scenarios. We have a good option to pick, and I don't know if the board member wants to include more scenarios or to work with these 4 that we have in the front of us. And I'm open for that.
Sure. So I think some of the feedback that we got the last time we had this in public was that the community would like the ability to do a what-if scenario on their own.
Sure.
And in fact, I think that was one of the sort of strongest suggestions that we got from the public. In fact, I think that having that ability gives not just the public, but us, the ability to run our own scenarios and find out why this doesn't work or why that doesn't work. Even running your scenarios, like one of my first questions is, how many schools change districts and things like that? And I don't know what the current distribution is by trust area, but I would assume that we would like to have some amount of equity or equality around how many schools are in each of our areas. And I'm wondering what happened to that suggestion, and are we going to be able to make that available, et cetera?
Sure, and one of the things that we can definitely do is look at the schools, where those may have changed throughout the scenarios, what schools kind of earn what boundaries, give you a breakdown of those. We can definitely give you that. Unfortunately, we previously have had the capabilities to offer an online portal for community members to kind of go in and build their own scenarios and physically look at the census blocks. However, I will say that most of the demographic firms that we've worked with are actually in a 3-month backup because of all the municipalities that are trying to use that. And so if we go 3 months out, that actually pushes us past that February 28th deadline to even open that sort of system up to the community. And so one of the things that I really propose and I would really love to have is obviously moving forward with community input or dialogue meetings is kind of gathering the community together, seeing what kind of input they can provide, actually physically walking around talking about the scenario, seeing what kind of adjustments they can come up with based upon what their knowledge is of the community. Then we can go back and see, does that actually make sense based upon the total population and the demographic numbers? Does that shift things? Is that something that may even be allowable within the constraints that we currently have for building a new scenario or maybe a different iteration of each one? And so, unfortunately, I can't provide you a definite answer to allowing for some type of online portal system for individuals and community members to go in and do that. At that time, from my knowledge and what we've done previously, with multiple districts, is we're kind of running out of time to do that because everybody's backed up. So unfortunately, that's kind of the case that we're up against and the constraint that we have.
And I realize that the late data from the census probably contributes to this. But if that's true, do we have the ability to extend the timeline so that we're not up against a deadline and we make decisions without good information, but that we can make good decisions based on good information just by getting a variance on the timeline?
And
Sure.
I have only to clarify, when you mentioned the sensor block, for example, one sensor block is one neighborhood, or the whole complete neighborhood. To make changes, you have to move the complete sensor block. That's when you can cut in pieces the sensor block. That to be the whole.
No, unfortunately, no, that's not something that you would want to do, is start to cut census blocks into areas, because then essentially you're cutting neighborhoods in half, right? You would be looking at splitting neighborhoods on, East Road is going into Trustee Area 5, where West Road, even though they're the same neighborhood, goes into Trustee Area number 1 or something like that. And so unfortunately, cutting census blocks isn't something that I highly recommend. Sometimes it can happen in very rural districts that have less than 1,000 student population or total population. Sometimes you kind of have to go through that process, but here at Palm Springs Unified, that's not something that I highly recommend. However, if that's something that you would really like to possibly look at, obviously reach out to legal counsel on that to see if that's a recommendation that they could make for this process moving forward.
The other comment that maybe it was made in another cities or agencies, this conversation is to continue, with the election using trusted areas, but the public have to know that this is just the process to elect the 5 board members, but after elected, we are elected to represent the entire school district. If they want to talk with anyone else, that don't make any difference if they live in different trusted area. They can use us for
Right, absolutely.
wherever
And
they
that's
live.
something that's,
Yeah.
really should be noted, is that you are only voted in by those that reside within your current trustee area. However, as a board, you still represent the entire district as a whole together, right? So you're not just particular looking at just one section, you're looking at the entire school district just as you would abroad.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Espericueta. Just to go back to President Wood's question about, is there any flexibility in the February 28th deadline?
Sure, and from what I've heard, from what I've seen, there hasn't been any type of extension from the state on this process. However, by all means, reach out to your local legal counsel to see if there has been anything that has come up, to see if there's any type of thing that the school district can do to possibly extend that deadline. However, everything that I've seen is a hard no, unfortunately, at this time. So by all means, reach out, see if there's anything that's possibly there with legal counsel, and see what might be possible.
And certainly all of the superintendents, this is a topic among all the districts with superintendents, and there's been no waiver for anyone, and at this time, no sign that the February 28th deadline would be pushed back any farther. So unfortunately, back to the point of the portal, really the late timing with the census does make that kind of option for us incredibly difficult and probably impossible
Right.
to do by the February 28th deadline. Mr. Clark, it makes me very nervous, but Mr. Clark has volunteered to analyze written suggestions, hand-drawn maps, things people say to him, in order to look at what some of those other options would be. And so we would still have that opportunity to gather that input both online and in person.
I don't know how anybody else feels about that. From my perspective, when people don't understand the census blocks and things like that, having them give you handwritten suggestions and things like that, you're back to splitting neighborhoods and
Sure.
those
One of
kinds
the things that we can
and-
also provide is before we go into those kind of community input meetings, is we can actually do a baseline census block map that actually gives you the population of each census block. So if you start to build your own individual boundaries, you can very easily calculate this up. Oh, I'm at 50,000 total population with this single change that I tried to make just because of the total population within each census block. So that's something that we could, possibly look at doing, just to give everybody a better representation of where that demographics and where that total population resides.
Yeah, and before we put you guys to any additional work, I think we would have to have a conversation, make sure everybody's on board with it, because if parity of the number of schools isn't important to anybody else, I don't want to put you to that work either. So I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I think it's hard with parity of schools because you have in some areas where there's really a concentration of students and not maybe a concentration so much as of voters, but the schools are really concentrated. You would have that in Cathedral City and you would have that in Desert Hot Springs. So trying to get parity might be a little difficult. I do think having the community input and giving the community the opportunity and your suggestion of really talking about not only why are we in trustee areas and why do we now have to go ahead and kind of readjust a little bit based on the census would be helpful to people. It is a difficult concept to understand and to move forward on. But you've given us 4 scenarios that really take into account, I think, a lot of different variants that we could probably adopt, I would hope, one of these with maybe some variation after input from the community.
Sure. Thank you.
I just have a question. I'm sorry I missed you in the last Zoom meeting and the background information. I know the census with 2020 and in the movement of COVID and the closing of doors and people secluding themselves, is the federal government looking at any type of the data being skewed or not represented in full form? Or I'm just wondering, because I live in a rural area in Thousand Palms, and I know that people weren't opening their gates willingly to talk to census people, and not even going to the post office or that type of thing. So in background, is there any variance from federal government that talks about we have a census and maybe it's not totally accurate or complete?
Yeah, and so from what I've heard, everything's been finalized from the U.S. Bureau and the U.S. Census Data that was released. I don't know of any type of different variants because of the the complete past crazy 2 years that we've had with COVID and everything else. I would imagine that there could be changes that from real population data, if we really got down to it. I would assume that there could be some minor changes, but it could also be up compared to being down. So I think in balance of things, I think with the data that we have working with is going to be a good representation of what we currently have.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions?
I'm pretty much going to echo what Karen said as far as the schools. I don't see how you could have parity or balance with the schools when we need to have the balance with the population.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's important to anybody.
It would be nice, but I don't think it could be done. And I just the way I'm viewing this, you guys, is the heavy lifting's already been done in 2010. We're just doing some minor tweaks now just to rearrange that balance. So, and I'm interested to see what the public comes up with, but again, they're not gonna be wholesale changes, I don't think.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thank you all.
Appreciate the
Appreciate it.
presentation, and
Yes.
we will reach out in the next day or two about the timeline for the next steps.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, board, cabinet. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming
Thank
out
you.
this rain.
Right. All right, item 3. Members of the audience may at this time address the Board of Education regarding only matters that are on the closed session agenda. Anybody? Seeing no comments, we'll now commence to closed.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. That'll end the YouTube stream. Thank you again for our